Thank you so much, Francois. So I think we'll start because you have an appointment to get to. We'll start with Israel Bartal with the first response.
Okay. Thank you very much for this illuminating presentation. And I have to admit that, well, when I read it in the first place, I thought that I wish I had it in front of me some 10 years ago on my desk when I was writing a comparative study on Stadlanut of 18th, 19th century Eastern Europe, starting with the Yampol blood libel that is mentioned in your full paper, and ending with 1881, 1882 Stadlanut cases on behalf of the Jews of Russia. And just let me begin with your final comments. I mean, the missing part that you promised to read to us, but never did. So I will read from that study that I published several years ago, and I will give you the source afterwards. The disappearance of the formal Stadlan was one of the clear signs of the socio-political change experienced by Jewish communities in the multi-ethnic empires. In the 100 years stretching from the partition of Poland in the second half of the 18th century to the 1881-1882 pogroms in Russia. The abolition of the autonomous communities, the decline of the feudal corporate order in Europe and the Mediterranean basin, and the integration of the Jewish subject in the administrative units of the centralized state fundamentally changed the channels of communication between Jews and the authorities. However, while the role of the communal Stadlan became a thing of the past along with other positions in the pre-modern community, the need for the vital services provided by the holders of this position remained. As a collective entity, the Jews in the post-corporate era did not disappear from the ethnic social map. In the absence of the kahal or the councils, whose authorities were curtailed and eventually completely revoked, informal Stadlanim remained operating voluntarily and also spreading to areas of activity that were unknown in the pre-modern environment. So more or less, I think that your paper present actually a case study of the transformative era, and it sheds light on something that I would like to comment very briefly. First of all, the place of the what you call enlightened discourse, and I call I would say alternative Western-minded discourse. The case of the abolition of torture is a typical case of some other new arguments that began to be used in the second half of the 18th century in this transformative period. And my question to you is very brief. Could you identify other cases like the torture case that were involved in that kind of Stadlanut? That means the change of the narrative, the change of the Stadlanut narrative from the pleading for mercy or the legal, if you like, status of the community as an excuse, or the benefit that the Jews, have for the authorities or something like that, to all kinds of either enlightened arguments or moral arguments or things that were beginning to be used widely at the end of the 18th century and found their way well into Jewish Stadlanut in the middle of the 19th century. We have the wonderful study by the late Jonathan Frankel on the blood libel of Damascus, and the way how new arguments were mobilized in order to, something that was almost totally missing in the case of Yampol, for example, 1756. This is one thing. The other thing is the continuity of the cooperative function into alternative Jewish organizational, if you like, either voluntary or semi-voluntary or alternative organization that were still recognized, sometimes formally, by the way, in the Russian Empire, after the partitions of Poland. I would like to take the case of the text of published in 1763, based on the document, the Documenta. I studied that, and I have been teaching that case for, I think, more than 40 years in my seminars. And one thing I would like to draw attention to, when Ribal, the maskil, Yitzhak Ber Levinson, published his apologetic book, Efes Damim, which was a kind of shtadlanut of the modern type, connected with shtadlanut of the pre-modern type. He published parts of the Documenta and added a Russian translation to that. And it would be very interesting for you to compare the translation and the changes that were made. But one more important thing, and I would like to draw your attention to that, is that actually Ribal was a descendant of both Meir Yevelovich, okay, and also he was the grandson of the brother of Eliakim Zelig of Yampol, that the guys who went on behalf of the Vaad Arba Aratzot, of the Council of Tolerance, to Rome, and Ribal boasts the fact that he used papers that were kept in the family. So we have kind of a, if you like, continuity of shtadlanut going via also changing types of elite that were part of the cooperative system in the second half of the 18th century and still going on in the beginning of the 19th century, and I would claim even that the second half, but that's another story. One more thing is that I have a comment on your interpretation of the term the nation of the Jews in Poland. Actually, mind you, that Eliakim Zelig of Yampol, who is called Jakub Jelek in the Latin and Polish and whatever, French documents that we have from the Vatican, signed, like in Hebrew, emissary of Vaad Daled Aratzot. That's fine. But the Latin translation, he appears like the emissary of Congressus Generalum Judaeorum Polonae. And also in Polish, Generalność, that is Universitas Judaeorum. So this term was used also to describe the so-called the Jewish nation in the cooperative era, which gives you the idea actually that it had nothing to do probably with legal terms, because the Vaad Arba Aratzot and Vaad Medinat Lita was never recognized for these functions by the Polish system. It was actually recognized only for one thing, and that is the taking care of the tax system. And by the way, if you read carefully the text from 1764 of the abolition, the decision of the Polish Sejm, they say, since this organization takes upon himself things that it is not supposed to take, and they are wasting the money, blah, 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 we abolish it. But there was nothing like recognizing that prerogative, because the legal power came actually from being, consisting of representative of kahals. That's the point, I guess. And I think it should be mentioned. So it more or less makes your argument even much more complicated. It was changing, but still, the language that was used and the terminology that was used. And after all, as you remember, Vaad Daled Aratzot was abolished in 1764, but it took them almost 30 years to return the money to the guy who went to Rome, and also to Yevelovich, because it's claimed somewhere by the Committee of Liquidation, if you remember, that he did it without the permission of the Vaad. However, because he did it for the good of the Klal Yisrael, is said in Hebrew, Universitas Judaeorum, we should return him the money to check on this. So you see, it's kind of, and last but not least, the Mendelssohn thing, which is highly important. I read carefully the text of the introduction by Moses Mendelssohn. Of course, he doesn't say that he sent a letter, but he says some lines below that he talked to some, important people or aristocrats or whatever, I don't remember the exact German words, in Poland about the blood libel. So there is no direct connection, but I think he kind of alludes himself to that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm glad you were able to stay this long.
I answer right away as long as Israel is there.
Okay, I have to
yes.
stay for 10 more minutes, so take...
Is that okay with you, Gur?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Good. Yeah, thank you so much. Obviously, I will not start a fight with Israel Bartal here, and I don't need to, because I think we are mostly in agreement. Changes in discourse. I think this is really. I mean, what this case shows is a form of cooperation which is entirely new in its form. Because this is something which I will obviously develop in more detail in the written form. I mean, this will be part of the study of Stadler-Nuth the world is waiting for since 20 years or so. The fact that all these files are in one folder in the Royal Archives is in itself a very important indication that this was a highly coordinated effort. All sources explicitly and at length reflect on the atrocious nature of torture. They all go back to Beccaria. They all come out of the same discourse, whether it's a source from the Jewish side or from the Polish aristocratic side. Things are very complicated at the time politically, but on this one they all agree. And this is a very fine line to distinguish between enlightened and Western discourse. This is obviously a very popular book at the time. Recognition of the representation. Now, that's obviously we are entirely on the same page on this. The Wahrheitsort was perhaps not representative in a political, constitutional meaning, but de facto, yes.
Yeah.
And it is abolished in 1764, so it couldn't sign anymore after that. So things got more complicated. My study will obviously develop a couple of. I mean, the last chapter will be dedicated to Moses Montefiore. I don't go to 1881. I stop with Moses Montefiore, who, in all the letters which we have documented in a digitization project, is called Stadlan exactly one time. In the thousands of documents, Mendelssohn is called a Stadlan once. Montefiore, sorry. So there is a lot of change going on. So the abolition of the end of the formal community, it really ends the traditional idea of Stadler-Nuth, and we have so many examples of people who's, I mean, Jolanta Jündul in her undervalued book on the blood libel discusses at length the 1816 case, where it is actually the wife of one of the defendants who speaks to the emperor. She has no legal title to speak to anyone from a legal point of view, but she's going to Warsaw and speaks to the Tsar because he happens to be in Warsaw, and because she just goes. She does what a Stadlan always did, and she, to a certain degree, is efficient. At least it is noted, and the emperor takes note. So what we have is, and we are entirely in agreement, a diversification of intercession, and I would not call it Stadler-Nuth because this is obviously connected to the constitutionally established community. The Wahrheitsort, I think, is a complicated matter. I mean, in volume 34 of Pauline, we have a beautiful chapter by Adam Kazimierczyk about the dysfunctionality of the Council of Four Lands. It was complete shambles decades before the abolition of the Wahrheit. But it could serve to put out a treatise was a possibility. But the major fact here is the addressing of the public, the use of the vernacular, the opening, what I call the opening to the public sphere. We can't, it's not because they are so smart or they have read Habermas, but because they knew they have to do it. Because the attacks on the Jewish community were so dangerous and so aggressive that one had to use all the venues available. I mean, what happens in the 18th century is dramatic from a point of view of real imminent danger to the lives of Jews in the Rzeczpospolita because of the changes of the Frankists' intervention, etc., etc. So, thank you very much for your observations, and I'm sure we'll stay in communication.
Excellent, thank you. Professor Hundert, I suspect, has some things to say about 18th century Poland.
Well, I've been known to do that. First, thank you very much. I mean, it's really wonderful material that you've assembled here for us, and a lot of it quite new and eye-opening. I'm glad you draw attention to this document. I've always thought that this is worthy of a lot of attention. It's a very important kind of turning point in interventions. But I want to begin with a sort of dessert for your talk, a different form of intercession that I found in an 18th century book I've been living with for a very long time. And I'll read my attempt at translation first, and this thing I think I have to read in Hebrew also. Jews believe that during the meetings of the Sejm, when they considered an action against the Jews, that Elijah the prophet would present himself before the Sejm, disguised as one of the delegates, and he would get up and he would say, "Nie pozwalam, Eini maskim, I don't agree to this law," and the law would be canceled. So, והיו עדת ישראל מאמינים שבעת הסם, כאשר מתחילים להרשיע נגד עדת ישראל, אליהו הנביא מראה עצמו לפני הסם, כשר אחד מהמשולחים הנ"ל, ואומר, אני איני מסכים לתקנה או לגזירה זו, ונשפט לה. So sometimes you don't need authorization from some legally constituted assembly. There are other ways of, by the way, you can tell that the author doesn't believe this story, right? How you, Jews say, not. So I just have a couple of kind of comments about this. One, I think that your insistence on the formality of the appointment, the Stadlan, is too narrow. That is, I think that Jewish intercession tends to be opportunistic, it tends to be adaptive, it tends to be situational, and not always with some kind of formal resolution or appointment or document or something like that. So I would be cautious about restricting things so narrowly. One of the things that interests me is that sometimes when there are accusations against individuals, the community intervenes, and sometimes it doesn't. And it depends on each community, each individual to raise money to try to defend itself. Second, what comes out of this clearly is Jews' close familiarity with the power structure and the wielders of power in the state. And here, I think, with the Tuta Salver and other people who you've mentioned, that there is room to explore the Masonic connection. I've always thought there should be a book about Jews and Masons in Eastern Europe. Jacob Frank told his followers to join the Masons, but there were other Jews involved, and people said about the Tuta Salver that he knew Hebrew better than the Jews. I don't know about if there's really something that says that he had a Jewish ancestry. That I haven't seen, but maybe.
The conjecture.
Yeah. So this Masonic connection, and Nathan Sternhartz, in his Likutei Halachot, talks about the terrible phenomenon that he's observed, that Jews are going to Masonic churches. He calls the temples churches, but this was a present. So he's in the 1820s. a little bit late for me, but but it's clearly an important vein that hasn't been properly explored. And and I don't think Shkolnik can mean rabbi. Yeah, a deputy of the community of some kind or other, but I've never seen it used as rabbi. That may, who knows? But I have some doubts. The other thing that I wanted to sort of stress that comes out of what your paper explores in part is that intercession was not just dropping sums of money in people's pockets. There were substantive arguments made, sometimes by non-Jews and sometimes by Jews. I remember this, one of the delegates that went to see the papal nuncio at the time of the Frankist thing invoked Augustinian theology in his debate, in his presentation to the nuncio. So that Stadlanot, or intercession, is not just a matter of bribery or gifts, but it's a matter of substantial argument. And I think I'll stop there so that maybe there'll be time for a question or two.
Yeah, thank you so much. Do you want to answer directly, or should I collect questions?
I think we can.
We're
Thank
fine.
you.
We're fine.
Yeah.
So we'll add a few questions, and you can respond to all of them together. So please, the floor is open. Adam first, yeah, and then the back. They're here. Oh yeah, wait for the microphone. Sorry.
So first of all, thank you, Francois, for another really enlightening talk that really takes the discussion forward in a number of ways. My first thought was precisely what Professor Hundert said, that this question of Stadlan as a kind of very formal thing isn't quite how it worked, as my impression. Some communities didn't employ a Stadlan deliberately, and they expected the elders to do that work rather than having a paid official. And this question of flexibility, I think, is also something that's really interesting. Jewish politics, as I understand it in the early modern period, and probably into the modern period, is successful because of its flexibility, because it is able to learn the environment in which it exists and then work politically within that environment. So on the one hand, when you talk about what's happening in the age of the Enlightenment as something entirely new, of course that's true. But on the other hand, as far as the Jews are concerned, this is just a different environment to do what they've always been doing. And so there's another sense of kind of continuity within that, which I think I didn't pick up in what you said, but I think it's actually quite significant. Because in order to have a history of politics, you need to be able to see the continuity as well as the change. I've got lots of things to say, but I'll just say one more thing. And that's this question of the blood libel, which has really become a cottage industry in a few years. Everyone's writing about the blood libel as if it's a thing. And I'm not entirely sure that it's a single thing. It is an accusation against Jews that played different roles in different times and worked in different ways. And Jewish politics, the politics of intercession, had to be aware of the different roles that it played at different times in order to deal with it. So I haven't studied this enough to give a weighty comment, but my sense is, if you're looking at this 16th and 17th century, where there's much more localized businesses happening in communities, the best way to deal with it is to deal with the people who are running it, and their motivation is always between popular religion and economic needs. And so the best way to deal with a blood libel in that situation is to identify the people with the economic needs and pay them off. You're not likely to persuade the people from popular religion. And in the period you're talking about, one of the things that sort of struck me from what you said is that the blood libel has become a pawn in a struggle between the Enlightenment and popular religion. Mm-hmm. And so it's the blood libels being used in a different way for different aims, and so the Jews need to change their response. And that was the first story you said about, crikey, where's the name? I wrote his name down. The very first story that you gave, the first book you showed.
Wojcicki.
Yeah. The Jews there come with an old-fashioned form of Stadlanut, which isn't right for the age of the Enlightenment, and so he kicks them down the stairs because they're not answering the need. What they needed to do is the other story that you told was them creating a new form of Stadtlandnut which actually fit the age of the Enlightenment. So it's all the same point I'm making in different ways, but it's a wonderful talk, and it's really made me think. I've got lots more to think about, so thank you.
Thank you so much.
I think
Please,
I would
yes.
like to react to both. I mean, thank you, Gershon, and thank you, Adam. I wanted to create a typology, so to speak. I obviously I'm aware that that intercessors could be non-formal. I mean, could be ad hoc as Israel Bartala has identified them, and that there was a huge degree of flexibility. There's a very instrumental way to go about the case of torture being atrocious and should not happen to protect the Jewish community. They don't buy into the entire world of the Enlightenment when they make this argument. To the contrary, I mean, it's actually in order to protect the community from interference. And this is what I'm very grateful for David Sorkin to have published his book about emancipation now, making the argument that whatever Jews did politically was to get equal rights. And I argue actually, no, it's a bit more complicated because and as I have recently shown in an article about the intervention of Elisir de Leon with Tsar Alexander I in 1817, there were Stadlanim who tried to protect the Jewish community from any change from the outside, and did this through Stadlanut and using arguments of whichever kind came handy. So I fully agree that if there is one hallmark of Jewish politics, modern and pre-modern, it is its flexibility and the ability to negotiate whatever it takes to achieve a goal. And I would like to refer back to a talk given by the here present Michael Zilber in 2002 or 3, when was it? About the socialization of the Stadlan, about how knowledge about Jewish intercession was handed down from generation to generation. You remember HS in Boston, I think? Beautiful paper. We haven't seen the written version, unfortunately. That was wonderful. Yes, there's an understanding of how to do things, and this is something which is instrumental, which is case by case, and it's not constitutional. It's not formalized, and I obviously fully agree with that. The other side also changes. So Wojcicki is a very interesting case because he goes at great lengths to show his expertise on, as I explained, I know the Jews. They have a kosher knife, they have a moreh, they have this calendar, he wants to show that, and they have the Chasidimov. So he doesn't want to be the idiot in the village. He wants to show that he's actually, they say they are enlightened, but actually I'm more enlightened, and I still don't like the Jews. That's the point. He insists on his prejudice, or he insists on his assessment of the Jews. And again, yeah, obviously, the Jews of Old Kush use all venues possible. The bribe, the court, laying siege to the prison, they do everything. But they also have the kahal. And that's actually very, very important. And the kahal is targeted by the accusation and by the law enforcing authorities. Against all evidence, the entire kahal is put into prison. So that's also interesting. Thank you.
I think Professor Wolf and next door.
Again, as has been said already, totally fascinating lecture. I learned a lot from that. I wanted to pick up on something that it follows on Adam's question. It's a little bit about the fact that you have to present this lecture in reverse chronology, beginning with the case in the 1780s and then moving to the case in the 1770s, partly because the logic of development suggests that the case in the 1780s is carried out in a more old-fashioned way than the case in the 1770s, which conforms more to our sense of the way an Enlightenment case should be handled in the public sphere. I'm a little bit interested in how you would see the broader chronology of the way these cases follow on the multiple cases dating back to the middle of the 18th century, which we know are a little bit anachronistic for Europe as a whole, coming in some sense 2 centuries too late for what we think of as the landmark cases of European blood libel. And what I'm most interested in is the ways that these fit into a particular Polish political and ecclesiastical moment in the second half of the 18th century. And for the 2 cases that you speak about, the cases of 1774 and 1787, you say cases that are very dangerous for the Jewish community, but as you tell the story, also cases that are clearly dangerous in a different way for royal authority, and cases that put Stanisław August on the spot in very particular ways. And what I'm interested in is thinking about what this tells us about the partition period. That is to say, the 1774 case is taking place at the moment of the partition Sejm, when the authority of the Polish crown has been shaken in a really dramatic way and is being reformulated in the context of what will be called the Stachelberg proconsulate. And the 1787 case is taking place on the eve of the meeting of the 4-year Sejm, at the moment of Stanisław August, the very year of Stanisław August meeting with Catherine at Kaniów. What we could say is almost the last gasp of the Commonwealth before it's about to be superseded by the 4-year Sejm and the Constitution of 1791 and the 2 final partitions. And maybe also interesting, if I remember correctly, 1787 might even be the year of the death of Kajetan Soltik, the man who originally promotes the blood libel as the making of his ecclesiastical career back in the 1750s and the 1760s. So it marks a natural end in the progress. But what I'm interested in is how we should understand the nature of royal authority at these 2 moments, in the 1770s and then in the 1780s, and whether we should think about that as part of the political context for understanding why these cases are handled in slightly different ways. By the way, totally fascinating, the portrait of Tu and Stanisław August as Alcibiades and Socrates by Bacciarelli. I've never seen that before. Really, really interesting.
Thank you so much. And right next, I think we had a question.
Thank you. Well, I just would like also to start by saying that it was a wonderful lecture from which I learned so many interesting things about the Polish Enlightenment, and which I didn't know, and I was very ashamed that I never heard about Łukasz Tu de Selver and also many other cases. I'm really grateful for what you presented, and I have 2 remarks. One is about when you mentioned Bishop Młodziejowski, and you said that he belonged to that group of people who were very strongly Enlightenment-minded and at the same time politically pro-Russian, which is a sort of contradiction. I would say that up to 1788, up to the start of the Great Diet, it's not a contradiction at all, because the whole politics of Stanislas Augustus is to reform the country to win Russia's approval for cautious reforms of the country. So in a sense, there is connection between the pro-Russian political line and Enlightenment reforms. Then it changes in 1788 with the Great Diet. And another thing is I'm very grateful also to Professor Gershon Handred, who mentioned this role of arguments in this Jewish intercession, because the Christian side stereotype was always that it's only about bribes. Yes, the Jews come and bribe the judges, and then they get what they wanted. But here in this case, it seems to me very clear that there is something more, because if we look at Stanislas Augustus as a person, then he is probably the most enlightenment-minded person in Poland at that time. His memoirs in Polish translation, because they were written in French, were just published 2 years ago. When one reads them, my impression was that I read the text of a 20th century liberal who by some strange coincidence was capsulated in a time machine into 18th century, goes out, looks around, closes his eyes, and then tries to do something. So he, and this criticism, apart from his dislike of idea of ritual murder as a prejudice, fanaticism, Gothic remains whatsoever, it's also part of his general educational, so to say, cultural politics, which is about, so to say, modernizing the way of thinking, of which also the Committee of National Education is a part. So I believe that here, in a sense, this Jewish intercession reached the right person, reached a person who was very receptive to the sort of arguments that they were presenting. Thank you very much.
We had one more question. I saw a hand up. I don't remember where it was. Oh, please.
Just a brief question. First of all, thank you, Francois, also for the plug. Since you've worked also on Stadtlandnut in Central Europe, where I think court Jews play this role without any formal sort of appointment. I mean, no one appoints them. They're the ones who are the obvious candidates to advocate something for the Jews. So something like that. And I just a prominent personality who was close to the court, who has connections rather than a formal appointment. And the second thing what I'd like to ask you is whether or not there are lawyers who are frequently used by the Jewish community to formulate precisely the way you said, to use whether it's theological arguments or legal arguments and things like that, especially when you see that what is submitted often, at least in the ones that I know, it's in Latin or it's in German legalese, which you find very difficult to think that local Stadlanim or communal heads might have been the ones who formulated it. So, is there do you find that there is regular sort of connections to lawyers like that?
Yeah, thank you very much for these questions. Well, working on this particular chapter is really challenging because answering Larry Wolf's observations, because you get sucked into the petition period politics. It's incredibly dynamic and incredibly complicated. The king tries to establish the Rada Nieuwsająca, the everlasting council, as a counterbalance to the aristocracy, to the magnates. And is challenged. Those who challenge his authority on that are those who are on the same page with him, for example, on ritual murder or the abolition of torture. Żywuski is entirely on his side on that, but he's on the other extreme of the spectrum in matters of the power of the aristocracy. And how they come together is the really fascinating story here. And the figure who brings it all together is de Tout de Salvert. I will really invest a lot of sweat into finding more about this guy. I mean, I found some memoir of a Prussian aristocrat who had been in his flat and has seen his collection of books, and he says a couple of things about that which are quite fascinating. And I really believe that the Prussian-Polish negotiations in 1775 are extremely important to establish the connection between the Polish court and the Jews close to the Polish court and those who try to save the Jews of Galicia. But I agree, obviously, that the framework, the framework changes from the immediate post-petition one period to the 1780s. 1774 is a moment when there is still a lot of hope that by reforming, and this is also the energy which brings these people who formally are on different pages politically, come together to modernize the Rzeczpospolita, for example, by abolishing torture, and that's very different in the 1780s. Professor Janowski, that was a slip of tongue. Obviously, I'm aware that there's somebody who is in favor of Russia is not necessarily unenlightened, however strange this may seem today. It is it's funny to read, for example, Walter Waltosz, the historian, who says, "Oh, by the way, it's very sad that all those who tried to abolish torture were on the dark side of history." So in favor of Russia, and that I obviously agree with that, and I hope to find out more about the Toulouse Verte. The court Jews in Central Europe, Michael, that's obviously the fundamental difference between Central Europe and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And I mean, Adam has this wonderful article about the constitutional legal differences between the Holy Roman Empire and the Rzeczpospolita. This is the major difference. There is legal security, at least theoretically, there is legal security for the Jews in Poland and Lithuania, constitutional security, which doesn't exist in Central Europe. You still are a servus camere in German-speaking territories, which obviously puts the Jewish communities in jeopardy. Legal expertise, by all means. I mean, the defense of the Jews of Grabie is written undoubtedly by a professional lawyer. It is an amazing document. It just reads as, I mean, New York Times or whatever. It is on a very high level of it's extremely clear, extremely well argued, extremely rich in its documentation. It's not by some aristocrat put together after breakfast. It's by a pro, and we have more examples of that. I mean, that's part of the flexibility. If you have somebody who can write up something which is convincing in court, and courts were not puppet theaters, these were courts, I mean, legal courts, I mean, all the better. So that's part of the story, obviously. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you all. Questions, and I think we're on lunch break now.